OWS fam, the nation, my dudes and dudettes, Hilow here, bringing you a sneak peek best ball plus live draft recording. We're going to call this a progress check over the first 3 weeks of instruction that we've been through. And this is going to be obviously tailored to the underdog theory instruction that we've been going through and the game theory instruction that we've been going through. What we're going to do is we're going to jump into a best ball mania for draft. This will be my 32nd entry. I went over my broad game plan development for how I'm handling the BBM. I cranked out 26 within the first 3 or 4 days that the contest was open in the highest variance window with a maximum exploitation strategy. And now we are basically into this one a day until I hit 50 in this first draft window. So we're going to wait for this to fill. We're going to bring it up and we're going to go through kind of a live example exercise / progress check to cover a lot of the theoretical concepts that we've been going through over this first 3 weeks of this draft window. I'll talk about my personal game plan development for my overall portfolio for this season. We covered this this previous week on Thursday in the Game Theory podcast. And with the fact that Underdog is probably the most competitive platform as far as the skill level of best ball entries in your average draft window, I wanted to maximize my entries into that in the period of highest variance, which was right when the contest launched on Saturday following the NFL draft, and utilize a maximum exploitation strategy during that draft window. I wanted to do that because I felt like I could gain an edge without sacrificing expected value for the entirety of the contest because we didn't know the NFL schedule yet. What I did personally is I correlated in division because last year about 60% of the week 17 games were divisional games. So I did so. The biggest one that was a hit was Minnesota Green Bay. And then backed into a few like Tampa Bay, New Orleans that are a little bit less meaningful, but still valid. In doing so, I wanted to max exploit on Underdog with a sharper player pool, hit as many as I could, and then spread those rest of the 50 drafts that I had allotted into this early draft window, which I define as the opening of the contest to the opening of camp. The second draft window for me is the opening of camp until the preseason. And the third draft window is from preseason until the kickoff of the NFL season. I went straight 50-50-50 entries. So 33% of my entries in each of those draft windows with the same mindset in each one of those snapshot windows in the overall draft window. It from the sense of the variance is going to be highest at the beginning of those respective draft windows. And why did I break it up, my personal allotment of drafts, into those 3 unique draft windows? Because those are really the major news cycles throughout this offseason where we begin to get more information from the league. We get more fidelity in camp battles. We get more fidelity with injuries because those are going to happen between now and the start of the NFL season. We get more fidelity for camp breakouts and depth chart battles, things like that. So that was my overall game plan from Underdog. After I get through a bunch of those, that initial rush of drafts in the highest variance spots, that's when I started going to DraftKings, FFPC, drafters, and attacking those player pools because they're a little bit, with the exception of FFPC, the Underdog, really DraftKings and drafters are the two that are kind of the lower. Sorry, the draft is starting, so we're going to jump over there and share this bad boy. But those are really the two platforms where the player pool is much weaker overall than on Underdog. So we're jumping into this best ball mania draft, drafting from the 5 slot now. And we'll talk about a lot of the concepts that we've covered to this point in the draft season, in the draft cycle, and kind of get a real life live example or putting some of the theoretical components that we've been discussing into play in real time. Calling it a progress check, we're basically just seeing the theoretical methodologies that we've discussed put into practice here. So as you guys are intimately familiar with, you know my rankings. Cooper Kupp is my 1.01, sets up real nice. We'll see what happens if he falls to us at the 5 spot here. Highly likely the way that the drafts have been going. And see some cool stuff that you can do by taking Cooper Kupp in the first round. Obviously, have to kind of hold that in check with him starting the draft season rank going ADP 6.2-ish. And now dropping down to 5. That's probably my fault. No, I'm just kidding. So when we get here, a lot to think about with week 17 correlation. I'm thinking about that stuff already in the first round, but I'm not forcing the issue in the most important rounds in the draft, which are the first 7 rounds or so. So we'll go Kupp. Going to increase my exposure a little bit there. Again, with this max exploit strategy that I adopted, I have no issue pushing the envelope in individual player exposures because I know that because I'm only allotting 50 drafts to this early draft window, I know that I can manage that overall exposure as we jump into the second draft window and the third draft window. So there's some interesting things, and the reason why I like Kupp or really any of the early 4 wide receivers, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, and Cooper Kupp, those are the guys that have a legitimate shot at the 1.01 in all of Fantasyland this season. And when you marry that idea with the value at running back that is available at the 2-3 turn or the second and third rounds, you can start off with a very, very strong build with 3 players that have the potential to finish at the wide receiver 1 or RB1 at their respective positions. So it sets up really nice. A lot of people are just hammering wide receivers blindly in the first 4 rounds because we know that, as we've talked about in the past this season, player valuation, roster construction is approaching the range of Nash equilibrium. What is Nash equilibrium? Nash equilibrium is when no one agent or player in a game can gain an appreciable edge over any other through a single methodology. Player valuation has been going that way with each subsequent season that we've seen, and roster construction is approaching Nash equilibrium as well, with more and more of the field privy to what is optimal in these contests. So some interesting things too to consider. The 3 quarterbacks that are going off the board first, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, and Josh Allen, have been going in the middle of the second round as the primary stack options once the schedule was released. And they're starting to slip more into the 2-3 turn range. So some interesting things that you can do with back stackability options. But on this, I'm going to go with, this is like a standard Hilow optimal start. Well, it's a SHO, standard Hilow optimal, because these 2 players have legitimate shots of being the finishing wide receiver 1 and running back 1 when all is said and done. When we start getting down into here, again, you can see this range of running backs, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Breece Hall, and Ramondre Stevenson, all have a legitimate chance. They're all being drafted around where median outcome projections have them ranked. But I would say it's probably biased a little bit more towards the upside at their current valuation. So there's some room for ceiling versus opportunity cost, and also some ceiling or some room for closing line value versus ADP, as in those players would be likelier to jump in ADP once we approach the most accurate ADP, which is going to happen obviously right before the kickoff of the NFL season. So as we are kind of find ourselves here now, Cooper Kupp and Nick Chubb off the board for us. We still have all types of maneuverability, but starting to think about what projecting what the coming few rounds might look like. No way Tony Pollard's fallen this far. Stream jinx. But as you see, like those three names, and we talked about, I didn't even mention Tony Pollard because I didn't think he would be an option, but Tony Pollard is another guy similar to Breece Hall from the sense that he has the potential for closing line value versus ADP where he's going at right now. And his ADP is probably slightly tilted towards upside when we're talking about median projections. As things currently stand. Obviously, Dallas can add it back, can bring Zeke back. Lots of things that can happen there. So this is a primary decision point of where we want to kind of take this roster. The wide receivers available in this range, DK Metcalf and Deebo Samuel, I have where they're going now, their ADP biased towards the downside. So I'm actually going to go Ramondre Stevenson here and remove the uncertainty regarding Breece Hall's injury. Obviously, he is less likely than a guy like Javonte Williams to start the season on PUP, but there is the potential for him to start a little bit slower. That's not necessarily just a bad thing, because if you can get Breece Hall rosters into the playoffs, now you're looking at lower ownership on that roster construction. A lot of things that come up after these first three rounds, people think about bye week, stuff like that. I'm not even worried about that at this point. That will all sort itself out throughout the rest of the draft. So we started here, Cooper Kupp, Nick Chubb, Ramondre Stevenson. This is probably closer or further away from how the field views optimal construction through the first three rounds, but a lot to think about from overall roster construction. We still have all the options available to us. I have no problem even going another running back if we see an ADP faller. And with basically the goal in mind with this high variance associated with the early draft window, that we could see more opportunities for closing line value versus ADP. So we see this range here in the late third with Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews in particular. Their ADP has not naturally lined up to this point in the draft season, being that they are both going pretty close in ADP in the middle to sometimes later third round. So their ADPs have never lined up. What that means to this point is we're not going to see a lot of Mark Andrews and Lamar Jackson stacks to this point. The problem with pushing that now is we don't know where ADP is going to go over the next 3 months. So if you're pushing ADP now with that stack, theoretically, it makes more sense to do so in a snapshot, what I call it, a snapshot contest, something like the puppy, where the draft window is only 7 to 10, maybe 11 days long. Whereas, so in those snapshot contests, you're not going to see the amount of ADP movement that we're going to see in a contest like the BBM, where the draft window is open for an extremely long time. So while you can think you're generating leverage by reaching on Lamar Jackson or Mark Andrews to create that stack now, we don't know how ADP is going to move over the next 3 months. It might line up more naturally down the road. So this is a spot that could be viewed as suboptimal as well. leaving the fourth round with only one wide receiver. TJ Hawkinson, my ranking updates are coming here soon. TJ Hawkinson is going to jump Mark Andrews for me in my overall rankings, up to tight end 2. And he provides some interesting game theory leverage if you think through what you are saying by taking Cooper Kupp in the first. Obviously, we didn't have the chance or the option to draft Justin Jefferson in the first in this draft. But if we're saying that Cooper Kupp, you're sinking a first-round pick into him, you're saying that I expect him to finish as the overall fantasy 1.01. That's like what in a vacuum, that's what our first-round draft picks are saying. So by taking TJ Hawkinson, it's leverage off of the fact that we're projecting via our roster and how we're putting our roster together, projecting that, one, Justin Jefferson does not finish the 1.01. How does that happen? Is an injury to Justin Jefferson? We're also thinking about week 17 correlation. And week 17 correlation is not simply what players I have on my roster. It's what players I don't have on my roster. So I do not have Justin Jefferson on my roster. I get to week 17. Now I have this leveraged position saying Justin Jefferson, rosters with Justin Jefferson in week 17 somehow fail. Well, how do they fail? Well, one viable option is TJ Hawkinson hits hard and succeeds. So the leverage by taking TJ Hawkinson, even though it's not considered optimal to leave round 4 with only one wide receiver on the roster, we're starting to build in intrinsic correlation and leverage through how we're building this roster out right now. So we're going to do something and talk about it as we do it. So Michael Pittman here probably would not be my top selection off the board in the 5th. But what it does is it gives you what I call back stackability. The ability to, the way that I think about quarterback stacking, quarterback correlation is, do I have to be thinking about it prior to, which would be considered back stacking? Or is the quarterback going off the board first, and then I have the ability to take his pass catchers after the fact, which would basically I would classify as front stacking. So being able to project kind of where we're going, and obviously that sets up Anthony Richardson here. I know major ADP mover. I know there's a lot to be said theoretically about that, considering he was going in the 120s, 130s, 140s even sometimes. I mean, his opening ADP was like 148, something like that. So a lot to talk about, to consider with that move, but there are ways to still build Anthony Richardson rosters without sacrificing expected value on those early draft rosters that have him super late ADP. We talked about that in the Underdog Theory, I believe it was week 2 session. And we'll start to see kind of what that can look like from this build. Another interesting thing to think about with that specific pick of Michael Pittman is, how is the field likely correlating Indianapolis and Las Vegas? It is highly likely to be with either Davante Adams or Josh Jacobs. And if that's the case, now we're starting to talk about a first-round pick and how do they fail in Davante Adams. Well, it could be that another player on this team succeeds in week 17, and it's not Davante Adams or Josh Jacobs. Percentage solution, like 90% of the time, it's probably going to be one of those primary contributors that is contributing to a massive spike week in week 17, but who we talked about this yesterday in the Thursday Game Theory podcast, this idea of what ifs. And what ifs goes kind of hand in hand with the idea of if-then statements. But if Davante Adams does not end the season a top 6 wide receiver where he's being drafted, why is or how did that happen? What if he gets injured? Who benefits the most should Davante Adams get injured? Well, it's probably a combination based on the personnel that are on the Raiders now. It's probably a combination of Josh Jacobs and Jacoby Myers that is an interesting backstack option to kind of what we're building and targeting here. So this is an interesting decision point, and it's primarily between Brandon Ayuk, if taking the ADP discount, and you know what, we're just going to do that because there's some interesting things to talk about with that as well. The San Francisco-Washington Commanders game is not getting a lot of press as far as Week 17 matchups go. But what it effectively boils down to is that game is now effectively a Shanahan versus Bieniemy game. And we've seen how those games have played out in the past. Obviously, Washington is not the Kansas City Chiefs. Sam Howell or Jacoby Brissett is obviously not Patrick Mahomes. But interesting thing to think about as far as the on-the-field chess match that is going on between those two, I guess, coaches that are in charge of their respective offenses. One being the head coach, obviously, in San Francisco, and the other, the offensive coordinator in Washington. And the back stackability with that game is kind of off the charts the way the ADPs are lining up currently. There's a lot of fun things that you can do with Washington late. So the fact getting a nice little discount on Brandon Ayuk kind of makes that decision fairly easily. So again, you see we're through 7 rounds or 6 picks for us, and we don't really have much in the way of correlation for week 17. Totally fine at this point. There's a lot of good things that can still be done. And now this is an interesting decision point as well, because now we're sitting with Cooper Kupp. Cam Akers is top ADP on the board. We could also go Deontay Johnson, some back stackability for correlation there. And we could also grab Jahan Dotson for the same reasons that we just grabbed Brandon Ayuk, but I'm actually going to go with this. And now we have the 2 primary contributors to the Los Angeles Rams and some fun that can be had there. I'll talk about it now. These 2 wide receivers are on offenses with extreme levels of ambiguity at the wide receiver position. Darius Slayton and Marquez Valdes-Scantling. I'll start with the punch and then we'll explain a little bit of the why. I project that Darius Slayton and Marquez Valdes-Scantling will lead their respective teams in snap rate, in total snaps played this season for one very specific reason. And it goes into this idea of the chess match that offensive coordinators are running in today's NFL. In today's NFL, we see majority of the defense defensive alignments that are built from defensive coordinators are built from too high or cover two principles. What that means is two safeties on the field, and the variations of cover two. We've seen cover two. We've seen cover two press, cover two man, Tampa two. Also, the introduction now of quarters in today's NFL. All of this kind of leads to a starting point from a defensive coordinator's perspective that provides the same look to a quarterback pre-snap. How offensive coordinators are countering that is through safety manipulation. Two primary ways that they do that is through a speedy Z wide receiver. So Darius Slayton and Marquez Valdes-Scantling fit that build, and pre-snap motion. They want to see the reaction of the safeties to pre-snap motion. Is a strong side linebacker following the running back? Is a safety cheating down into the box? They want to, that worked out well. We're just going to go jump on this to complete one of our primaries. And we'll talk about some stuff with Anthony Richardson here shortly of optimal. I'll get into that after the kind of too high shell discussion. So if those are the two ways that offensive coordinators are choosing to manipulate safeties against too high cover two, cover two press, cover two man, quarters, all these variations of looks, defensive alignments, and looks that have two safeties on the field, it places an increased emphasis on these Z-type wide receivers with speed. Why? Because they are utilized to manipulate safeties. That is why we joke that Marquez Valdes-Scantling is out there running wind sprints. That is why Darius Slayton has a very low targets per route run rate. But they are on offenses that we expect to score points, and they are going to be, per my theory, they are going to be on the field the most of this wide receiver group that has an extreme level of ambiguity currently. So if that's the case, they're running deep routes, they have high ADOTs, they're going to be on the field a lot. Now we're getting into the realm of spike week potential over the sample size of one NFL game. And these are players that are highly valuable to best ball rosters from that sense for weeks 15, 16, and 17, where we have a core of contributing members on the roster, but we're looking for those outlier spike weeks. And these are the type of guys who can provide solid ADP value through that lens. This is an interesting decision point, and I'm going to take the ADP value here with some interesting options still available to us. Now that we have two quarterbacks that have extremely wide ranges of outcomes for this coming NFL season, we'll talk about the theory associated with that. Anthony Richardson, Deshaun Watson are majority of the time utilized in three quarterback builds. But because they have such wide range of outcomes for this coming season, we want to be drafting as if we are right. And if we are right on this pairing of Anthony Richardson, Deshaun Watson, what is that saying through the lens of the optimal theory, whether or not I want to have them on two quarterback rosters or three quarterback rosters? Theory would dictate that it would be optimal if these guys are hitting ceiling together in the same season. Sample size of one, right? We're playing best ball. Our sample size is an entire season. If they hit their top 10% in their range of outcomes, they're hitting it hard and they're going to have elite ceilings. So optimal theory would dictate they are most optimally built into two quarterback builds. So this kind of hamstrings our kind of Los Angeles Rams construction here that we were doing. But I was fine taking Anthony Richardson. We already had Michael Pittman, and I was fine taking Deshaun Watson. We already have Nick Chubb. And Nick Chubb is a guy who I'd expect his role to grow a little bit as he's entering the end of his contract years with the team, and a team who, based on their roster moves, their everything they've done, bringing in Deshaun Watson, has identified a window of kind of win now mentality. So we're going to do this. We talked about the theoretical components of somebody like Jacoby Myers probably being drafted around his median outcome, but some of the bets that we've made in the first round, one being Cooper Kupp over Davante Adams, obviously would make very little theoretical sense to take someone like Davante Adams over Cooper Kupp. We can get our exposure to Davante Adams with later picks, but we're still placing bets on this roster, and it fits very nice with multiple layers of theoretical correlation that we've built into this roster. The primary two being we have an Indianapolis skinny going with Anthony Richardson and Michael Pittman, and now we have the correlation for Week 17 with Jacoby Myers, and we're betting against Davante Adams on this roster as well. So this would be optimal if Antonio Gibson falls to us here based on numerous things, and there he goes. So that would have been optimal. Obviously, we had this Brandon Ayuk pick that we took beyond ADP at a value. And with that discussion of some Week 17 correlations, still have an opportunity to do so a little bit later in the draft. We're going to swing upside at this point in the draft. Swinging Jalen Hyatt. We have some early season help already at the wide receiver position. Jalen Hyatt would be more of a late season upside type pick, but we're doing that route, that relative reach versus ADP here to kind of get some exposure to this Rams game environment that we have already built into this roster. So as you can see, we've talked about some things and we've had to make some on-the-fly changes going into all the things that we've talked about maintaining fluidity and being able to react. Did not think that this roster was going with Anthony Richardson and Deshaun Watson. The fact that Deshaun Watson fell so far kind of forced the issue a little bit and gives us a good path to closing line value and upside at the same time. So through 11 rounds, two quarterbacks already. That's not going to happen very often for me, how I'm approaching these drafts, but again, it was difficult to pass up here. The three running backs all have elite ceiling. Cam Akers, debatable, but he worked with kind of the construct that we're going here. 5 wide receivers with what we're telling here, Cooper Kupp being the 1.01, kind of how we're building this roster, and then the 1 tight end with TJ Hawkinson. Lots of things that we can do with TJ Hawkinson. Lots of things that, considering here, now that we're past kind of the final tier gap, major drop off at tight end is probably David Njoku. With that being the case, definitely, and since we have the 2 quarterbacks that we do and we're not looking to add a third, we still have the ability to add 2 more tight ends to this build. A lot of rosters that have TJ Hawkinson that are investing a 4th round pick are not going to be 3 tight end rosters, which gives us a little maneuverability and leverage potential on this roster as well. So we're going to complete our optimal week 17 correlation for our primary piece, which is Anthony Richardson. We have Anthony Richardson stacked with Michael Pittman and Alec Pierce, the 2 primary wide receivers, the 2 primary pass catchers really on Indianapolis's offense. And we have the correlation with Jacoby Myers built in. So sorry, I took a break from talking, but the wheels are turning how we can proceed from here. Speaking of the Z-type wide receivers, Donovan Peoples-Jones fits that build as well and would probably be the preferred target here. So it's okay. MVS goes off the board there. Also the potential to take a tight end here with a rather steep drop off in tiers amongst these tight ends coming up, but there's 3 of them still on the board, which makes me a little bit less interested in that. Had we gone, well, I'll save that. We are going to do this, a little bit of that action. Now, the options to, now that we have this kind of roster constructed the way we do, Deshaun Watson and Nick Chubb, obviously, rounding that team stack out with Donovan Peoples-Jones, but the options to backstack the Jets are extremely limited. It's basically Mecole Hardman and Tyler Conklin at this point, but there's some interesting potential once we start getting down here for our what would project to be our RB5 on this roster. The upside is with Izzy, has a 3-down back build, can do kind of everything that he'd be asked to do in that offense. Have Michael Carter, who has proven that he can kind of do what he's probably going to be expected to do or asked to do. So I'm not really worried about the backstackability of that game environment just yet, because we still have some options on the table for how this roster is being built. Scroll way down for that one. But that goes into this idea of Eric Bieniemy against Shanahan in Week 17. I talked a lot about Logan Thomas and how he is probably screaming value at this point in the draft season. In every game that he was healthy in 2022, he outsnapped and ran more routes than Bates, who started the offseason being drafted way ahead of Logan Thomas and now is going basically undrafted. So that has fixed at least. But Logan Thomas, as you can see, is ADP 215.9. That means majority of drafts he is going undrafted. A couple of things I'm thinking about. Obviously, we're going to do this for our Minnesota correlation here. The thing I was thinking about is Greg Dulcich and Gerald Everett double stacking the tight ends from that Week 17 game. It would have been a stretch for both of them to line up, but there were 3 rosters behind us that only had one tight end, so highly likely that wouldn't have made it back to us. And we still have the option here with Dawson Knox, who I think is extremely undervalued based on all the hype with Dalton Kincaid right now. I'd expect Dawson Knox to still operate as the primary tight end for the Buffalo Bills. And that is important for us because we invested a 3rd round pick in Ramondre Stevenson here. They play Week 17. So ideally, based on how we've built this roster, is we wait on these tight ends. We get Dawson Knox to fall to us, which is relatively likely at this point based. Oh, shit. This dude is sniping the shit out of us, man. Aye. No worries. Still some options there. So now we're just going to take the extreme. This guy's not going to take a tight end. If he does, GG's. But we're going to take the extreme value here with Greg Dulcich, assuming this guy doesn't auto draft. Yeah. So fairly extreme ADP discount there with Greg Dulcich. I think he pairs nicely with the build that we've got going on here. Still the opportunity to get another major faller should that happen, and get that correlation. And if not, we obviously have the fallback on Logan Thomas. Late auto drafter. Ooh, just timed out. So Taysom going over Gerald Everett too. Gesicki as well. Whew. We can make it through this pick. Oh, we got to make it through Jerryfish. Zinga. Ain't no thing. Now we would really like Khalil Shakir to fall to us as that potential. We still could go Deontay Hardy late if Khalil Shakir gets nabbed here. But as you can see, we've built this roster with high levels of correlation, and we did it in what amounted to a flexed game plan based off the first extreme value here in Deshaun Watson. And we're not afraid to reach where it makes sense to complete that week 17 correlation. But obviously, we don't know what is optimal with reference to, like, we don't have a solver here telling us the optimal pick at each position. We don't know at what point in the draft is correlation more important. We don't know at what point in the draft closing line value is more important. We just know that they are both important overall. So we just took our 9th wide receiver. So what does that mean projecting this team and our positional allocations? Well, we have a decision to make. Are we going to go 3 tight ends and 4 running backs, or are we going to beef up the running back position to 5 running backs? And there's a lot of theoretical components that go into that. With how we've built this roster and how much upside is present in the first 2 picks. And that's why I said I'm not afraid to take glaring ADP value in the first 3 rounds and leave that first 3 rounds with 2 running backs, because we still have this flexibility later on. We can make 4 running back builds. We can make still 5 running back builds. I would not venture a 6 running back build if we are sinking 2 of our first 3 picks into the position. But Darius Slayton now leaves the conversation. Should have a long time ago. Once we reached a little bit on Jalen Hyatt, we are now betting that Jalen Hyatt is going to be the most valuable wide receiver for the New York Giants. There's also some theoretical components by only taking 3 running backs. And now if we decide on a 4 running back build, we have this extremely fragile RB4 with Izzy. But again, if we're putting this roster together as we are right, I'm wondering if Michael Carter makes more sense as that player. We're going upside here. So So because we went upside, we still have the flexibility to make that decision on whether or not we want to bump this to a 5 running back build or a 3 tight end build. And the way that this roster is built, either option is acceptable at this point. And the reason why the decision point came between Michael Carter and Izzy is Michael Carter has a better chance to have a weekly contribution as things currently stand with no injuries, with a healthy Breece Hall. But Izzy carries the greater late season upside. So because we made that decision at the previous decision node in this game tree, we're now basically saying that we're betting on Israel Abanikanda working into a more valuable role than Michael Carter. How is that likeliest to come? Through an injury to Breece Hall. So if that's the case, we're basically in this idea of trying to sneak out of this draft room and have enough contributions from Izzy late in the season where now we are leveraged on the field once we make it into the postseason. The reason why I was between those two backs obviously has the correlation component with the week 17 stack here in the Cleveland and Jets. And the reason also why I went 9 wide receivers is because Michael Pittman and Brandon Ayuk are extremely fragile wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3 from the sense of they have a rather wide range of outcomes. Obviously, we've placed bets already on this roster at the quarterback position with Anthony Richardson. So we're saying that he's going to hit a 90% outcome, which means a higher outcome for Michael Pittman is much more likely in addition to Alec Pierce here. So a lot of theory discussion and a lot of things that kind of changed how this draft went. But as you can see, we still have a solid overall roster construction. We're in the overall guidelines of what is optimal roster construction. And our final decision point is whether or not we want to add a potential upside running back like Kareem Hunt, potentially this extremely fragile, Keontae Ingram, extremely fragile, Malik Davis, extremely fragile as well. We don't have any Philadelphia components, so he kind of falls off there. We don't have any Detroit components, so he kind of falls off there. So it's kind of between these two picks here. And I'm going to go with a fragile running back build to build that correlation, which is correlated to Brandon Ayuk for that late season. So that is our roster, the dreaded 2-4-9-3 build. A lot of things we talked about how we got here. And then that led us, obviously, we're still having this internal battle and these at each individual decision point throughout this drafts, with each decision point being each individual draft pick. So now we are basically extremely correlated. Our primary stacks, Anthony Richardson, we have the Anthony Richardson double. We have the Deshaun Watson double with Nick Chubb and Donovan Peoples-Jones in that Z prototype wide receiver role. We are correlated off of our theoretical reach here in TJ Hawkinson with Jaden Reed. Again, late season considerations only. We took the extreme value at Greg Dulcich. We have the correlation with Logan Thomas to Brandon Ayuk. We have the primary correlation to our stack. And again, some further theoretical bets that are being made here. You know, should there be an injury to Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers is probably one of the main beneficiaries. We have a mini correlation for week 17, Cam Akers, Cooper Kupp, and Jalen Hyatt. So you see all these, and then finally we have the Ramondre Stevenson and Khalil Shakir week 17 correlation as well. So count out, we have basically one player on this roster that is not correlated for week 17, and that player being Greg Dulcich. And you see we got an extreme ADP value there. And I could see his ADP moving up slightly as we get into the later portions of the draft window as well. So that's going to do it for our week 3 progress check for 1 week season, the Best Ball Plus product. If you are seeing this on YouTube and you're not familiar with 1 week season, we are your theoretical teachers. We are going to train you to be better at the game of DFS and the game of best ball, because NFL knowledge is not going to get you very far in these games based on the skill level of the field. With that said, I am Hilow. You can find me in the 1 week season Discord. Best Ball Plus members, head over to the Best Ball Plus thread, and you can find me on Twitter at HiloFF, and we will see you in those draft